All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nasser El-Batal. I'll be introducing basically enterprise architecture based on TOGAF to you this afternoon. Along the way, if any questions, you can type in the Q&A field if you wish, and I'll be more happy to answer your questions as we move forward. So as you know, a lot of organizations are running into some challenges in a relationship to delivering their business outcome, in relationship to sustaining their maturity, in relationship to governing, controlling risk and cost, amongst a number of many other topics that you need to deliver at the end of the day. So enterprise architecture based on the TOGAF framework will certainly facilitate and help the organization and the structure to be put in place in order to deliver that business outcome at the end of the day. Of course, in order to do or in order to establish this, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate solutions in place, because we have quite a bit, of a number of best practices, frameworks, standards, and so on out in the industry. And of course, each and every one of them will have its own subject matter expertise, its own benefit, and so on and so forth. The question now becomes, which combination of these framework would be most suitable to your organization in effort to making it work or to making it happen. TOGAF by itself, or enterprise architecture by itself, is not going to be able to do the work. It has to be supported and or enabled by a number potentially of other best practices depending on the goals and objective of the organization. So if you want to define processes, IT service management processes, you will need something like ITIL. If you want to ensure that you have proper governance and control, you will need something like COBIT. In, of course, addition to the enterprise architecture framework that you have in mind, and specifically what we're talking about here is TOGAF. Now, also in order to make it work, you want to make sure that you have all the enablers in place. You want to make sure that, as an example, you have identified potentially what your goals, objectives, and strategic intent is supposed to be. And from there on, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate governance, the appropriate frameworks to use. And in the background of all of this, of course, you need to have some assets and resources, as well as some project management methodologies to ensure that you can approach this from a structured perspective. So there is a little bit of homework, to work with beforehand to ensure that basically you have all the enablers and critical success factors in place so that your program is successful. Now, the one thing about TOGAF, and just to make sure that we all understand what TOGAF stands for those who are not familiar, TOGAF is pretty much the acronym for the Open Group Architecture Framework. Again, the Open Group Architecture Framework. So TOGAF as a framework introduces not just the framework, from a high level, but also introduces the specific steps, the specific methodologies along the way for the framework to work properly. So it's giving you a step-by-step approach as to how you establish the enterprise architecture, what do you need to consider in terms of different areas, in terms of different structures, in terms of different, as we call them, guidelines and techniques along the way. So what I've done here is just to show you as an example, when you are working with the framework, you have the ability also to inject it with a lot of other, inputs from the industry. So requirement management, this is where, of course, you're going to collect, and this is where you're going to filter and establish your requirements based on which you're going to invoke the TOGAF approach. And along the way, you need to prepare in preliminary, you need to establish your vision and direction, your targets in the architecture vision. And then from there on, in terms of business architecture, information system architectures, technology architecture, this is pretty much where we are defining and or developing the architecture itself. And we're going to notice that as we move along the way, we're going to have an iterative approach at the end of the day. So once we established the definition and or the architecture itself, now we work in opportunity solution and migration planning in effort to introduce the blueprint or the architecture itself, and eventually phase G or implementation governance will work with the external partners and or vendors to make sure that your architecture is actually delivered and or translated from the conceptual part to the physical part. And finally, you're gonna need to do some change control along the way if and when any changes happens throughout the life cycle of the enterprise architecture work. You notice we have a two-way relationship between each and every one of these phases and requirement management, and that is because as we start working with these different phases, we may be changing or we may invoking or we may be modifying some of those requirements, and that's why you see that relationship throughout the life cycle. Also, I added some green boxes to show you the need, where potentially you may be using some additional frameworks, and the examples as I'm showing you there, as you can see, are associated with COBIT or business analysis or ITIL or project management, depending on the activity or activities that we are working with. So again, a very iterative, structured approach, an approach that considers methodology as to how you're going to perform enterprise architecture from the moment of invoking the requirements all along to establishing the strategy, and then definition and development of the architecture, implementation, and eventually governance and control. So you notice there is that arrow that's dropping down to the next slide from implementation governance. This is just to highlight that we are dependent on potentially other frameworks and or partners that will use these frameworks in order to translate the concept onto a physical solution. Now, it is very important for you and for your organization to make that solution your own, because enterprise architecture by itself, based on TOGAF, is not going to be successful alone. So you're going to need to work with additional subject matter expertise, as an example for system development life cycle, or project management or process definition and design or governance and controls, along potentially other frameworks that you might need to follow and or need to use as well. So we're getting into a little bit more specifics associated now with the TOGAF approach. Again, as I mentioned, this is based on the open group framework. Pretty much is going to detail all the aspects that you require to establish as part of your enterprise architecture. Again, as I mentioned, is giving you a step-by-step approach to your architecture. And what we have seen, a little bit earlier, let's go back to it to make sure that we're speaking the same language. This over here is what we call the architecture development method, right? ADM. So if and when you hear that term, you would know pretty much that we are talking about the enterprise architecture lifecycle or the enterprise architecture development method based on the TOGAF framework. And as I mentioned, this development method takes you through a number of different considerations, all the way from preparation to strategic to development to implementation and eventually governance and control. Now, the framework itself was based on a number of different standards and or frameworks that generated from the defense industry in some cases. And what you see here at the bottom of the screen in terms of acronyms, this is basically some of these sources, if you wish, when we're talking about something like TAFM, so Technical Architecture Framework for Information Management, DODAF, again, Department of Defense Architecture Framework, and the international standard IEE, and you're going to see a couple of code numbers along the way as well. So the framework, big picture as we call it, in other words, all the different components of the framework, right? We're talking here about 7 components. Realistically speaking, the framework, in terms of implementation per se, is made out of 6 components, but then we have the introduction that makes it 7. The concept is that we're trying to bridge the gap between your current business situation and the desired business capability. So we're trying to bridge the gap between those two verticals, as you see them on the screen, right? And in order to do this, as we talked about a little bit earlier, we're going to start with the heart of the framework. And as you recall, we called it architecture development method. In the red bar that you have noticed on the right side of the screen when I was talking about the ADM, we have all the guidelines and techniques associated with the ADM work. And then we're going to have, architecture content framework to show us, where the content and what the content structure going to look like. Eventually, we're going to have some sort of a tool. For those of you who are familiar with ITIL, as an example, we have something we talk about as configuration management database and configuration management system. So in this example, when we're talking about enterprise continuum and tool, this is the tool from the TOGAF perspective. And as you are working with the enterprise architecture, you want to make sure that you establish your internal reference models and or your internal standards, but also you can use what's available out there in the market. So there are, as an example, in the industry, standards and or frameworks associated with data structure associated with technology, associated with application and so on. So being it your own or being it the one that you are using and or borrowing from the industry, that will still fit under what we call the TOGAF reference models, or also we talk about it as enterprise architecture assets, right? And eventually, after doing all of this good work, combined through all of these different areas, the goal is to make sure that you are actually achieving, the capability or enabling your organization to have the architecture capability to enable you to do proper architecture work. So in the enterprise architecture domain, as based on TOGAF, we have 4 domains. And these domains are basically what we consider business architecture, technology or application architecture, data architecture, and technical architecture. So those are the 4 areas or the 4 domains that you will be actually architecting for, right? Eventually, there will be other areas. I'll revisit them over the next couple of slides. There will be other areas where we're gonna basically use roadmaps and bridge the gaps and so on in order to make it work. So these are the different components of the enterprise architecture framework. We talked about the architecture development method, or the ADM. And this is also what we consider the heart of the TOGAF framework. All right. These are the 4 domains that we just kind of highlighted, even though they show 3 areas on the ADM. You have business, you have information system, which includes data and includes application. So those are 2 domains over there. And then you have applications. So that makes them 4 domains. These areas are eventually, again, linked, right, to your content framework to show, the details of the information that you have been using. And eventually you have the reference models, right? As we talked about, you have what we call technical reference model, TRM, and you have the 3 I's reference model, or integrated infrastructure information, right? Which is application based. So you have technology based and application based reference models, and whatever potentially you have in the industry out there, you can bring in if and when you see if it's suitable and or feasible. We talked about the guidelines and techniques. So as an example, when you're doing stakeholder management, when you're doing risk analysis, when you're doing iterations or risk mitigation or business analysis, when you're establishing a business case and so on, all of these different areas or different items are actually discussed under what we call the architecture development management or architecture development method, guidelines, and techniques. You also have your continuum, and this is basically a way to classify, right, your building blocks and eventually your architecture capability. Then this is where you have all your governance, your people, your expertise, your tools, your streamlining between enterprise architecture, program, and IT service management. So at the end of the day, you really have the ability, right, that enable you to perform enterprise architecture. So those are, as I mentioned, the 6 main areas plus introduction. That makes it 7 areas of the framework. Governance is very important, and we want to make sure that you have the appropriate structure in place, because if we don't have that governance structure, not only enterprise architecture neither in the IT service management or anything else would work properly as well. So you want to make sure that you actually have the proper, governance and controls, from enterprise architecture to program management to IT service management, and all they need to be aligned and all they need to be structured and governed properly. And as you see at the bottom, we've got basically all the enablers that will facilitate the decision-making process for the governance group that will be represented by the Enterprise Architecture Board of your organization. So a little bit more discussion here. You notice what we have in shadowed in red or burgundy, depending on the color on your screen. What we see in there is basically the involvement of the business analysis activities, right, in the architecture development method. So those phases I kind of overlapped, if you wish, between the architecture work as well as the business analysis work. So I will not be able to do much if I don't have a clear understanding as to what the business strategy and the business requirements are. And that's why there is a great deal of emphasis on the business analysis work in the middle of the ADM where requirement management is concerned. Not only there, but also in terms of preparation, in terms of visioning, and in terms of strategizing, as well in terms of defining and developing the architecture itself. So there's a lot of discussion about requirement, the initial requirements and the updated requirements throughout the different iterations. There are a lot of the discussions about modeling. There are a lot of discussions about ensuring that we have a clear understanding in terms of what the stakeholders want and or need in order to integrate this into the work that we are going to do as part of the enterprise architecture that we are putting together. Another area of concern is the different artifacts. So the artifacts are basically three main formats, or three main types, if you wish. We have catalogs, we have diagrams, and we have matrices. And those are the different formats that will actually describe what we call building block. So in this list, depending as to who you are and what is your role, if you play in the business side of things, right, then you are basically a stakeholder in this area, and you're going to be concerned with all of these different artifacts. What you notice at the bottom in the legend, we have the core content, and we have, as we call it, extension or addition or more detailed content. So the core content is a reflection of the work potentially that is a must or is needed as part of your enterprise architecture work, but everything else now is for additional clarification, additional details that you can establish. So depending as to who you are, as a stakeholder, you can be playing a role, in different areas, and as such, you're gonna need to see and or access, right, certain artifacts, because these artifacts will reflect your wants and your needs, that will reflect your concern, right, and so on and so forth. So without really going through a whole lot of details about it, this is the list of artifacts that we're going to be working with, and will be resulting as an output of the work of your architecture definition method or architecture development method. So in addition to all of the above, the discussion here is that the framework, and specifically the architecture development method, will enable you to establish, as we call it, your capability-based planning, which really is a transformation, or to be more correct, a translation of your strategic planning, right? So you need to consider, as a discussion of all of this, you need to consider, right, the famous people, process, and technology. And as you go through the architecture development method, you're going to notice that we are actually establishing, right, a lot of the strategic visions, strategic plans, right, goals and objectives as part of your phase A or the vision phase, which is going to dictate what is going to be needed, right, in the rest of the ADM, right? So this is going to manage and or create your capability, which are a collection of different increments and eventually a bunch of deliverables as a result, right? So as you see here, we are reflecting which phase is helping you where, and it's going to be the basis, for certain additional, portfolios or work packages to be part of portfolios, and so on. And eventually this is going to basically translate your strategy onto your solutions, as aligned and or as streamlined with your business direction and or your business outcome. So this is very important to keep in mind. Now, you want to make sure that you measure, okay? It's not just a matter of building or developing throughout, but you also want to make sure whether actually you are achieving what you're set out to achieve. So we do recommend, as well as the framework, as we call it, EQE type of performance, measurements and or classification, where you measure for efficiency, you measure for quality, and you measure for effectiveness. Now, why should you use reference models? I talked about reference models and I talked about standards, and eventually, right, these things become very important, right? Because it's going to provide you a common language, it's going to provide you patterns, reusable patterns, as an organization, so that you can use and reuse along the way. And it's going to provide you as, what we call, a specific type of business model that you're going to use to enable, right, your business, right? And with that, those reference models become very important. And, reference models really varies depending whether you are a government type of organization or private type of organization. But something you need to keep in mind, either or, some of these reference models are kind of, as we call them, diagrams, right? So are associated with modeling techniques, which is very useful. That becomes a common language. Others are specific to what you have in the industry, and we have seen a number of them. Something like BABOK, for those of you who are familiar with business analysis, PMBOK, if you're familiar with project management, enterprise architecture, TOGAF and Zachman, process, governance and controls, ITIL, COBIT, lean, and so on. And there is a whole bunch of many, others along the way that you can use depending actually as to what kind of organization and what kind of work you do. Also, if and when you are a government department, the government is known to have its own, reference models that will, to a certain extent, dictate as to how you're going to do enterprise architecture, within the constraints of things like jurisdictions or things like accountability or things like programs and services that you have, and so on and so forth, right? So even though you're using enterprise architecture, but you need to consider, right, something like your, GSRM as a government, institution, and your constraints within that. There are other reference models also, if and when you are a government department. So we talk about the public sector reference models, and there are quite a number of them. I'm not going to get into each and every one. This is just to show you that there are a lot of different considerations that you have to keep in mind. There are a lot of constraints that you have to work with, right? And want to make sure that you have the appropriate modeling, right, that you can work with. Unfortunately, the slide that you have on the screen now has been somewhat deformed with the format that has been used for the presentation. They used kind of a widescreen format, and as such, the diagram is not showing what it's supposed to show. Nevertheless, basically, the concept here is that we're highlighting, the need for modeling and modeling techniques so that you actually can establish the change and eventually are able to collaborate, to communicate, through a common language that will provide you clarity and that enable you an agreement and eventually transformation, right? So the context of this slide is that modeling and modeling techniques are very important because they simplify quite a bit the message or messages that you are trying to introduce as a result of your enterprise architecture. So as you are establishing this enterprise architecture, right, you are actually performing, a business transformation. And I know this is, the no word in the industry, because the moment you establish, or the moment you start talking business transformation, everybody is in panic and everybody is concerned, right, in terms of what to do, and it's a major program and everybody now is tense about it and so on. Realistically, we're not really doing something overnight. We're not doing something over the next month or 2 months. This is going to be a long-term proposition. It's not going to happen kind of suddenly, right? So you want to make sure that you have all the proper enablers, the interoperabilities, the patterns. You want to make sure that you're looking at the costs. You want to make sure that you're looking at the risk. You want to make sure that you align actually between what the business wants versus eventually the solution that is being introduced. Otherwise, it's just not gonna make sense. So really, this is the message at a high level. So as I talked a little bit earlier, there is a great deal of involvement and a great deal of details, right, with business analysis and business analysis work. So it's very simple, right? We can follow and or use the business analysis body of knowledge publication, and it's actually version 3 as we speak. It's no longer version 2. Version 3 has been introduced. Let me see, we're the 15 now. I believe it was introduced roughly about almost a month ago, a little bit less than a month ago. So at a high level, we go through the cycle where we are trying to understand, right, and analyze, what the requirements are. We try to elicit, we try to provide, some assessment to the solution and validation, manage the requirements, right? And of course, we need to ensure that we're in alignment with the business side of things. So there will be, an iterative discussion along the way, as we go through this exercise over and over. Again, my apologies that the diagram here got deformed, but basically each one of these areas is basically supposed to show you a phase, right? So if I can overwrite. So this is supposed to show you a phase of the work to be done throughout the assessment, or the business analysis to be more correct. So again, we're planning requirements, we're eliciting, we're analyzing, we're documenting, we're validating, we're testing. So if you recall, we talked about the architecture development method, and there was a big bubble in the middle. You can consider that this is the big bubble in the middle of that yellow diagram that we have seen a little bit earlier. So things to consider as well, while you're considering all of this. And the consideration here, I borrowed some of the continual service improvement concept. Realistically, it's not really about service improvement alone, but it's also at a high level the overall approach, right, to introducing anything, pretty much a project, a program, improvement. So if we're saying that we want to improve our organization and we want to introduce enterprise architecture, well, guess what? You follow the same model that ITIL has adopted from the Deming cycle. And pretty much, TOGAF can do the same. First and utmost, you want to know about the vision and or strategy. And then you need to establish your current situation or your baseline. You want to know your desired state, where you want to be. You want to know how you're going to get there, and eventually, did you get there or not? And you want to make sure to keep the momentum going, because if this thing goes cold, then you're in trouble. It's going to take a long, long time to revive it again. And we've seen it over and over in a number of different projects, that, I was engaged in, where everybody's all excited and so on. And then you have a change, of the guards, and different priority kicks in, and all of a sudden, it goes cold, and then it gets shelved, right? So you want to make sure that this thing keeps on going. It doesn't matter who comes and who goes, as much as possible. This is not something that is going to happen. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. Again, in terms of the original type of activities, and this is where we're doing potentially an overall assessment, it may take you, as a matter of fact, from a couple of months up to 6+ months, depending on the complexity and the size of the organization, and eventually the work, the implementation work, right? And again, depending on the complexity and the size of the organization, that may take you a number of years, especially if you are injecting your enterprise architecture with other frameworks, things like ITIL or COBIT or whatever other potential industry best practices that you may be introducing. So in order to do all of this, what we have seen thus far is actually the framework itself, and some of the main areas associated with it, its own structure and critical success factors. But one of those critical success factors really is who's going to do the work, right? And this is where you need to establish the appropriate roles and responsibilities. This is where you need to establish, the teams, right? And this is where you need to establish as well your RACI charts, if you are familiar with, what I'm talking about here. The RACI chart or the RACI model, where it establishes who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's, informed. And of course, you're going to have a number of people, right, at different titles that going to be involved in the introduction of your enterprise architecture framework. From there on, you will need some additional skills, and these are examples, right, about some of these skills, from generic to business specific to architecture to program and project management to technical to legal, and we can go on and on. The concept is really, you need to make sure that you have a good understanding as to who's who. So you need to build, right, as we call it, architecture skills framework. This is just a quick example to show you about generic skills, right? And along those titles, right, it happened that the enterprise architecture manager, of course, because he or she are accountable for the enterprise architecture, so they need to have, an expert level knowledge in all of these different skills, right? If you take a look at, the sponsor, or if you take a look at, a board member or an IT designer, very quickly you're going to notice that they don't need the same skill level. So this is why it becomes so important to know potentially what are the skills that you're going to, either hire or prepare for, and at what level, right, of expertise for the different people who will be involved. So in other words, you're building your team, your architecture team, in order to make it work. From there on, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there will be other capabilities that you need in terms of project management, program management, business analysis, consulting, IT service management, and so on. It really depends on what are the goals and objectives that you have in mind, what is the scope of the work that you have in mind as well. This is, ladies and gentlemen, our introduction of enterprise architecture based on TOGAF, the structure of the framework, some of the critical success factors, some of the dependencies between the framework and other industry best practices, and of course, what do you need at a high level in order to make it happen and or to make it work. All right, very good. So with that, we'll conclude the session. Over to you, Sanel.